My name is Dylan Shearsby. I'm a watercolour painter, sketcher, and teacher of watercolour and figure drawing. Watercolour sketching is a great way to start interacting with and recording the world around you in your own artistic style. It helps you develop quickly as an artist. It allows you to capture snippets of your life in an interesting way that you can share with your friends, and you can use your sketches as the basis for future finished paintings. In this video, I'm going to take you through the top 10 things that you need to start watercolour sketching. When sketching with watercolour, the first thing that I do is usually draw with pencil. Now you could use a normal pencil like this, but you would have to sharpen it and resharpen it all the time. So to avoid that, I use a mechanical pencil. This is a pretty standard one. The kind that you'll find at most places will have 0.7mm thickness lead, and it's usually HB. I prefer to go a little bit thicker and darker on the lead, so I use this 0.9mm lead B darkness. When people start out with watercolor, they're often afraid of the pencil lines showing through, but what actually happens is that the pencil lines disappear under the paint and they can't see them anymore. So don't be afraid to go dark with your pencil lines. And so this is my preference, just a basic mechanical pencil. When drawing with pencil, you may need to erase some of your lines. For that, I like to use a kneadable eraser. You can use the rounded edge of this, or because you can reshape it, you can create these sharper ridges and points to erase little details if you want to. Being kneadable like this, it does pick up a lot of grit and dirt and hair, so to keep it clean, I keep mine in a glass jar that was once a salsa jar or something, and that way it keeps it nice and clean, ready to use. I like to use watercolor paper pads rather than bound sketchbooks, and the reason for that is that way if I particularly like some piece that I do at a sketch session and I want to frame it, or if someone wants to buy it, which happened recently, I was sketching at a pub and someone on Instagram wanted to purchase that sketch, so I was able to just tear it out of the pad and ship it to that buyer. So also I like to use proper watercolor paper when sketching because it's good practice for when you do larger, more finished paintings later on. Now I don't use expensive paper for sketching. I used to use Arches watercolor paper when sketching, and that's quite pricey, but I found that this Eraldo Di Paolo watercolor pad works really well. It's very close to the expensive stuff, but much cheaper. This one is the 300 GSM medium tooth, and that just means that it's not super rough, it's not dead smooth, it's something in between, so it's the closest to the paper that I use for finished paintings. This is the A5 pad, this is an A4 pad, and as you can see, some cafe sketches in that, so I do recommend these watercolor pads. When you first start watercolor sketching, you could easily get away with just using one brush, and I would go for something like this. It doesn't have to be this exact brand. Most art stores will stock something like this. This comes from Rosemary & Co., a UK brush maker, and it is from their pointed golden synthetic range with a short handle. The series is 304. This one is a size 00. You don't need to use animal hair brushes when painting. I've only ever used synthetics, and they definitely do the job. And I don't think we need to be killing animals just to use their fur for our paintings. Synthetics work really well, so I can definitely recommend them. If you want to expand your brush range, this is from the same series, it's just a slightly larger. This is a number 2. This is called a rigger. So this is from their series 315, and it's a pointed rigger script, size 8. This is used for doing fine details, thin lines, the masts of ships or wires, tram wires, anything quite fine and thin. That's what this is used for. When it's wet, it goes to a really nice point. As with all good watercolor brushes, when they're wet, the tip goes to a nice fine point. Don't make the mistake of going out and accidentally buying acrylic or oil brushes. Watercolor brushes are a bit different, so make sure you're getting proper watercolor brushes. I also often use this square brush. So this one is from the Rosemary & Co. Series 303 flats. This is a 1/4 inch thick on the bristles, but there's a nice amount of length there to hold water and paint. So that's a good one. Another one that I use a lot is this Escoda from their Prado series. This is from their Tame Synthetic series 1462, and this is a number 10. This one is much like the first brush that I showed you, except the bristles are a bit more springy, so it holds its shape a bit better, and it goes to a really fine point, so I can do some really fine details with this one when it's wet. So that's really all you need to get started. I wouldn't go too nuts with brushes. As I said, you could really just get away with this one to begin with, and then you can slowly expand your range from there. You'll need some water when watercolor sketching. I use this washed out peanut butter container. Whatever you use just needs to be totally watertight, and it's nice if it's quite small like this. As you can see, my one is well used. It's a bit cloudy at the moment because there's some white gouache in there, but that's really all you need, and this will last a couple sessions before you even need to change the water. I've used a glass jar before, but that one leaked a bit, and so yeah, as I say, water tightness is kind of important. When it comes to a watercolor palette, you may think that you need something elaborate and fancy like this, but in actual fact, this is my sketching palette, and it is a tiny little eyeshadow container that I nicked from my mum, and it is perfect for sketching. As you can see, it's got 4 wells, one of them long enough that I divided into 2, and it's got a nice little mixing area here. And you'll see that I just use 5 pigments, which I will go through in a second, but a tiny little container like this is perfect. And the fact that it can be closed like this means it keeps the paints wet. You don't have to purchase watercolor pans for sketching. You can use watercolor straight from the tube and squeeze it into a palette like this. If you let it dry, the surface of it will sort of dry, but if you apply water, it will reactivate. A lot of people don't know that. You don't have to wash out your palette or anything. Just keep reusing it, just keep adding to it. And I will show you the paints that I use in a moment, but keeping them in some sort of logical order like this helps with them not contaminating each other color-wise. So let's have a look at the paints that I use. The paints that I like to use are Holbein Artists watercolors. These are a very good quality paint. They've got nice vibrant colors, they stay nice and soft and runny, and they don't use any animal products. A lot of watercolor paints have ox gall in them, and that isn't really necessary, so I can really recommend this range. Now, the pigments that I use when sketching are just these 5. If you were to only use 2 pigments while sketching, which you could get away with, they would be burnt sienna and ultramarine, these 2 here. That's really all you need. The burnt sienna, when applied thinly, creates almost a yellowish kind of wash and becomes darker and redder as it gets thicker. And that's your warms, and then you've got ultramarine light here for your cools. But if you want a bit more of a range with your color, the other ones that I use are yellow ochre, turquoise blue, and quinacridone red, which is a very versatile red when mixed with the other pigments that we've got here. So that's really all you need to do quite colorful watercolor sketches. Now, if you were willing to go even more minimal, you could forget about color for now and just use black. This is a bit worn out, but this is just the Holbein Ivory Black. And this is a really good way to start out if you're willing to just work in black and white, because it'll get you thinking in terms of tone and not worrying about color. And tone is really the most important thing when painting and sketching. You'll realize that over time. And so if you practice in black and white, it's very good for you. And then when you do move on to color, you'll be able to handle the colors a lot better. So that's something to keep in mind. But otherwise, if you are going to go to colour, these are the 5 pigments that I find most useful when watercolour sketching. When watercolour sketching, you're often going to want to be dabbing the tip of your brush to get rid of excess water or paint. For that, I just use any old rag like this. I think this was an old tea towel that I cut up. Any fabric that doesn't stretch too much and that absorbs a bit of water will work. As you can see, this one is well used, and there's no need to use disposable tissues or paper towel. So any old rag. When you get out and do some watercolour sketching, you're going to quickly realise that you're up against the elements, and gusts of wind like to blow away your sketch pad or flip the pages, which ends up smudging the paint and possibly ruining your sketch. So I highly recommend picking up some bull clips like these, and it can be a really good idea just to sort of clip the edge of your page when you're working on a sketch. That'll just keep it contained and stop the pages from blowing over while you're working. And finally, we have your dedicated watercolour sketch bag. I really recommend having a dedicated bag to put your kit in, because that way you can have it packed and ready to go, and it means that you'll use it a lot more often than if you had to gather your materials every time. I use a Country Road satchel that I found on special. This is a lot bigger than it really needs to be. The kit can fit in a very small bag. I use this one because I like the extra pockets and the option of being able to chuck in some other stuff like a water bottle or a book or whatever. But yeah, find a bag that you like and have it as your dedicated watercolour sketching bag. Having gone through the main 10 items that you need to start with watercolour sketching, there's just a few optional extras that I want to mention here. It can be a good idea to protect the tips of your brushes from getting squashed and possibly ruined. So it's a good idea to pick up something to protect your brushes. This is a roll-up bamboo brush wallet. It only costs a few dollars. I bought this from my teacher, but I'm pretty sure these are readily available online. So a good way to protect your brushes, and you can store your pencil in here as well. And even when I go out and do larger, more finished paintings, I can fill this with brushes, and I can put sometimes 2 or 3 brushes in each little pouch like this. So this is a useful and cheap way to keep your brushes protected. This is a little misting spray bottle. This is a cheap one bought from a chemist, like a hairdresser's one. Holbein, the company that makes the paints that I use, does make a dedicated watercolor misting bottle that's very good, but something like this is fine as well, so long as it's just a fine mist that doesn't send out massive droplets or spurts, and that will ruin the painting. So just a fine misting bottle like this can be useful for keeping the paper wet or your wash wet as you're working. And finally, I do often finish paintings off with some little opaque white details, and for that I use Holbein's primary white gouache. Holbein's range of gouache is very good quality, as with their watercolors. Their gouache does not dry darker than when it's wet. A lot of gouache is like that, which can be very frustrating. Theirs dries as it appears when you're painting wet, so I can really recommend their range. I'm not sponsored by Holbein or anything, but yeah, I do find their gouache to be very good quality. And gouache is just like watercolor, it's just the granules are larger, making it opaque so that it's not transparent. So it's a little bit like painting with acrylic on top of your painting, and I just use it for fine little white highlights at the end of the painting. So those are just some optional extras that you could consider to complete your kit. I hope you found this list useful in putting together your own watercolor sketching kit. Like and subscribe to receive notifications of when I upload new videos. I will be uploading videos showing my watercolor sketching process and other watercolor lessons and figure drawing lessons. Until then, I hope you enjoy putting together your own kit and getting out there and developing as an artist.